Hi, Mike.
Hello.
How are you?
All good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, very good. So, last conversation that we had, we talked about design systems and why organizations have them, what the advantages are, etc., etc. And this conversation, I want to open that up to design ops. And everyone's heard about DevOps. DevOps wasn't a thing 2, 3 years ago, and now it's a thing, and everyone really understands what that's all about. But in the context of digital design, the design ops, what is that?
Design ops or DesOps? Yeah, I think you're sort of right to draw the parallel with DevOps. As with a lot of things, I think the design community and the digital community is sort of following in the wake of development and IT, more traditional IT processes, which has obviously been around a lot longer and therefore have a lot more to teach us in terms of how to kind of organize and manage these activities at scale in a way that is kind of both effective and efficient. So design ops, I guess it means different things to different people, lots of different definitions. One of my favorites that I heard recently was a colleague had been to a conference and somebody had described design ops as everything the designer needs to do except design.
Ah, okay, that's a good.
Yeah, which I think is a little bit of a simplification, but if you think about it, it kind of works. We have designers who need to produce designs, but they receive the brief for that from somewhere.
Yeah, consistently, presumably.
Yeah, yeah. Constantly changing brief from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they'll receive that from stakeholders, project managers, product owners, perhaps in the form of wireframes or other kind of UX output. Then they've got to design, and while they're designing, depending on what kind of project they're engaged in, there will be lots of people who have a stake in how that design comes out. So lots of people who want to review it, comment on it, approve it. There may be corporate groups, teams, functions who need to more formally approve it to make sure it complies with guidelines such as accessibility or design language or visual identity, brand, etc. It will also need to be approved, reviewed and approved within its project setting, so that it is fit for purpose for providing the next stage of the work in feeding the dev process. So there's a whole bunch of kind of processes and activities in and around that individual Mac designing their beautiful web pages.
So that's interesting. So what about the tooling that's used then for design ops, DesOps? How does that work?
Well, it's a moving picture to be honest. For years and years now, there's just been a constant proliferation of the tools that are used in the web design process or the user experience design process. So we've got your traditional creatives using the Adobe Creative Suite.
Right.
You've got web designers who've more recently moved away from Photoshop, more towards Sketch for the production of web design deliverables. We've also had UXers move towards Sketch, but lots of UXers still using tools such as Axure. So in terms of the creation piece, there are lots and lots of options available. And you've got to be quite careful because it's really interesting how the choice of tools starts to dictate, often by accident, the way that your team works.
Right.
So for example, back in the day, the kind of ubiquitous tool for wireframing and creating user journeys was Axure, and is a really good, powerful tool, and you can use it in very simple ways. You can also use it in very sophisticated ways and build almost kind of functional applications, you know, with variables and
Yeah.
and if you're not careful, you will find your UXers who you really want to sit down and think through all of the options for how an experience should work. You find they can very quickly get locked into one of their options and spend an inordinate amount of time kind of effectively coding that option.
Right.
It's not really what you want to do. You know, that work
Yeah.
can come later. You want them exploring and innovating and playing around with ideas and testing and collaborating with other people in and around the process. You don't want them getting locked into kind of one option to sort of develop it. So there's like one example of how the tool can have, you know, unintended consequences. And then
who's doing this well then? What sort of organisations are doing this well versus, you know, perhaps organisations that are not adopted this method?
I think typically what we see is, yeah, I'm sure there's lots of people doing it quite well. I think the ones that sort of, without naming names, I think the ones that I think come across as from the outside clearly having a good process is obviously there's quite a lot of startups, businesses with a very sort of digital product management mindset. So some of the young challenger banks, I think, would sort of probably fall into that category as well. And what I think is key is those that are doing it well are those that have managed to establish our way of doing it across their organization.
Right. So it's almost like various functions are going to buy into the fact that this is how we're going to do the design process.
Correct. And, you know, every week you're going to have a UX or a designer come up to you and say, oh, I found this tool. I think we should start using this for this. And, you know, on the face of it, it's a great idea.
Yeah.
And in actual fact, the introduction of that tool into a process without carefully considered implications of, you know, how that's going to affect the workflow is really key. So I think the consistency at a kind of organizational level is absolutely crucial.
Interesting. All right, always a pleasure, never a chore. Great to see you again. I'll see you next time round with, I think information architecture, I think, was one of the topics we wanted to cover off in perhaps our next conversation. Yeah, I'll save the best. Look forward to that. Catch you later.
Cheers, Bob.
Cheers.